HP tired of being alone PT3. The days leading up to Christmas were uneventful and eventful at the same time. It might have been a contradiction in itself, but when you're celebrating festivities with the Weasleys, anything was possible. Harry and Ron never returned to the subject of what Ron should or shouldn't have done in the prefect bathroom with Lavender, and Harry didn't go out of his way to try to discuss it. He was quite sure that if he was told any more details, he'd never be able to look at Ron or Lavender the same again. Fred and George were another matter altogether. They might not know the details of their youngest brother's latest folly, however they'd taken to calling him the dreaded one every time an opportunity presented itself. Ginny was completely miserable and didn't care who knew it. She hated Fleur and was now having to share her room with her and Hermione. Hermione wasn't so bad, they'd grown accustomed to that sleeping arrangement long ago, and they were after all friends. When Fleur wasn't fawning over Bill, she was raving about how wonderful Christmases in France were. Hermione was sure Ginny missed Dean, and that was the reason she was on edge about everything. After all, she found Fleur perfectly lovely. Of course she would never let Mrs. Weasley or Ginny hear that. Mrs. Weasley was still mourning the loss of Percy as a member of the family. There were times when she could ignore it, but when her family was surrounding her, it was hard not to think of what it would be like if he was there. Harry himself was having a difficult time too. It hadn't hit him until Hermione, Ginny, and Fleur were decorating the living room. It was then that he remembered Christmas the previous year in Grimmauld Place with Sirius. He'd been so happy that they were spending the holidays with him, so much in fact he'd went through the house singing carols and decorated every room. That was the last happy memory Harry had of his godfather. Harry missed Sirius desperately. He'd been like a father, a brother, and a best friend all rolled into one, and his loss was still at times unbearable. Hermione had been helping Mrs. Weasley in the kitchen when she saw Harry walking around in the garden. She didn't have to see his face to know that he was upset. She didn't have to ask what was bothering him. After excusing herself, she bundled up to go out in the frigid weather. She walked up to him and took his hand in her own and led him towards the orchard so they could be alone. "I'm okay, really. You should go back inside, it's freezing out here," he said, looking down at her. "When will you learn that anything I do for you, it's not because I feel obligated?" she asked. "Probably a time or two more," Harry smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're holding up better than I expected you to," she said. "I miss him, I just didn't realize how much until now, I guess. There are times when we're at Hogwarts and I expect owls from him that don't come. Or something happens and he's the first person I want to tell. Like when you told me you love me, my first thought was to tell Sirius. But being here with the Christmas decorations and the music, it makes it harder. I remember how happy he was that we were with him last year. How sad he became when time drew closer for us to go back to school, and how withdrawn he became." "That's to be expected, Harry," Hermione said, running her gloved hand over his cheek. "He might not be here physically, but you know he's watching over you, him, and your parents." Harry nodded as he pressed a kiss to her palm. "I just have so much I want to say to them," he said, his brow wrinkled, his green eyes watery with tears. "I believe they can hear you," she said. "Think so?" he asked. "MHM. Christmas magic and all," she said with a smile. "I don't think I've heard of that branch of magic." "Do they offer courses on how to tap into it?" he teased. "No, it's a special magic, it can't be harnessed." "Well then it's defiantly worth looking into," he said. Hermione leaned up and kissed him softly. "I love you, Harry." "I love you too, my Hermione," he said. She gave him a small smile. "I am going to go back into the house, and when you want to talk you can find me." Harry nodded and watched her, his eyes not leaving her until she was safely inside. He knew that she was giving him the opportunity to get everything off of his chest. Things he needed to say without anyone listening. He sat down on a stone bench and folded his hands together. At first he wasn't sure what he was going to do. He felt foolish talking when nobody was there to speak back to him. "I miss you, Sirius," he said quietly after a long pause. "There are some mornings that I wake up and I forget that you're not here anymore. The first week after you went behind the veil and I was back on Privet Drive, I'd wake up and look at the calendar on my wall and think 2 more weeks until I can go to Grimmauld Place and see you. Then I would remember what happened that night. I don't blame myself anymore. It took a long time to stop doing that. Dumbledore helped me realize what I already knew. You wanted to help the Order, and that's who you are, ever the black sheep in the Black family. There's so much that has happened and I wish you were here so I could talk to you about it. Dumbledore's been showing me what I need to know to defeat Voldemort, and to be honest I don't even know where to begin. I'm scared that I'm going to fail him, that I'm going to fail everyone. There are so many counting on me and I'm just a kid. What if I fuck this up? What scares me most is Hermione. I've loved that girl since we were 11 years old. And when she looks at me and I feel like I am the chosen one and that I can defeat Voldemort with both hands tied behind my back with no wand. I think that I'm more afraid of letting her down than anyone else. I just wish you were here to tell me what to do." Harry let out a slow, uneven breath as he wiped tears from his eyes. At first he wasn't sure if he felt better or worse after his talk with Sirius. He sat there on the bench for a while. He wasn't exactly sure how long, to be honest. Long enough that his whole body was numb from the cold, by the time he managed to peel himself off of the bench and stiffly made his way back to the house. Hermione was standing at the door, her coat in one hand, her boots in the other. "Blimey, Harry," she gasped when he pulled the door open and nearly plowed into her. It was nearly an hour later before Harry was able to get a moment alone with Hermione. This was only after he'd been thoroughly fussed after by Mrs. Weasley and scolded for staying out in the cold for so long. "I really didn't know how long I'd been out there," Harry said to Hermione once they were alone. "I was really worried. I was coming to look for you," she said. Harry kissed her slowly, his hands sinking into her hair. "Thank you," he said. Harry woke up Christmas morning to find something shiny and tacky dangling in his face and Ron standing over his bed. It took him several times attempting to focus on whatever it was before remember that he wasn't wearing his glasses. Wiping the sleep from his eyes, he picked them up from the nightstand and slipped them on. The sight of a huge brassy heart pendant with the words "My sweetheart" engraved on it almost made him want to take them back off. "I know that we're best friends, Ron, but I'm already spoken for and you're truly not my type," Harry said dryly. "You know bloody well I didn't get it for you," Ron said in a murderous voice. "Is that what you got, Lavender? You should really let Hermione and Ginny help you out next time. You can't possibly give that to her." Harry slowly sat up and raked his hand through his ever-messy hair. "I didn't get it for her," Ron said, his voice rising again. "Then who did you get it for?" Harry asked. Ron shook his head. "She bought it for me." "She's punishing me, Harry." He started pacing the floor. Harry bit back a chuckle and tried to keep a straight face. "Well, at least it doesn't say my 1-1. You think it's funny, don't you? That would be considerably better than this." "Do you think she actually thinks I'll wear it?" he asked. "I wouldn't let Fred and George see it," Harry said, picking his own overflowing stocking up. "Blimey, they'd never let me forget it." Ron said, his face, which had been magenta, was now almost as pale as Malfoy's. "Don't worry, your secret dies with me," Harry assured him as he picked up his first package, which was rather soggy and smelled horrible. "What's that?" Ron asked. "From Creaker," he said cautiously, opening it to find a box of maggots, causing Harry to leap out of bed. "I wouldn't feel bad for not buying him anything, mate." Ron said, helping Harry dispose of it. The rest of the presents were much more promising from Fred and George, the latest of their new jokes, some of which wouldn't be available to the public until after the new year. His gift from Hermione was simple, but it touched him deeply. It was a picture in an antique pewter frame that she had snapped of the two of them on the footbridge at Hogwarts. The both were laughing and looked completely happy. An hour later, after Harry had finished opening his presents and dressed in the sweater featuring a golden snitch Mrs. Weasley handmade for him, he opened his trunk and dug to the bottom to find the brightly wrapped package. He'd found it before coming to the Burrow in August. From the moment he saw it, he knew that it was meant for Hermione. He'd been nervous about giving it to her, which is the reason he didn't have it placed along with her other gifts for her to find on Christmas morning. It was a far cry from the books that he usually gave her. He found his chance as everyone was making their way to the table for Christmas lunch. He pulled her into the sitting room so they could have a few minutes alone. "You're being all mysterious," Hermione said when he shut the door and turned to face her. "I wanted to give you your present," he said, handing her the small box. "It's not much, but when I saw it I knew it was meant for you." Hermione smiled as she tore the shiny paper, red and silver paper, then opened the box. Lying inside of the white tissue paper was a silver pendant. The center was etched with tree and the words, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." On the back in elegant script was engraved, "For Hermione, who has the heart and strength to change the world one house elf at a time." "Harry. Oh Harry, it's beautiful," she said. "It's kind of cheesy." He shrugged his cheeks a faint pink. She shook her head. "No, it's the nicest thing anyone's given me," she said, leaning up to kiss him softly. "I love you, Harry." He wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her back. "I love you too." He pushed her hair over one shoulder and picked the necklace up out of the box and fastened it around her neck. "Now I wish I would have gotten you something better. I just wasn't sure. I usually buy you something practical, but that didn't seem appropriate this year," she said, toying with the pendant. "I love your gift the best," he assured her as they joined the rest of the family for lunch. Everyone sat down around the table. It was a bit on the crowded side, but nobody seemed to mind. Mrs. Weasley was beaming over the new hat and necklace Fred and George had given her. And Harry couldn't help but notice the gold chain that disappeared into Ron's shirt. He knew that he was wearing the horrible gift Lavender had given him. Ron had always had a knack for complaining about things he cared about. Harry knew that Lavender's gift meant a lot to him, no matter how terrible it, and because of that he wouldn't say anything. "Why don't you pass the mashed parsnips one?" Fred asked. "I hope you choke on them." Ron grumbled, his ears turning pink, and he debated on throwing them at his brother. In the spirit of Christmas and because his mom was in such a lovely mood, he decided against it. "Ronald Weasley, I won't have you speaking like that to your brother. It's Christmas," Mrs. Weasley snapped at Ron. "He started it," Ron protested. The argument was never sorted out because the most shocking thing of all happened. "Percy!" Mrs. Weasley gasped. "Arthur, it's Percy. Percy is here." Mr. Weasley and everyone else turned to look out the large window. Sure enough, Percy, impeccably dressed as ever, was walking through the snow-covered yard. Everyone was in shock and Mrs. Weasley's eyes were filled with tears. Ever since Percy had parted ways with his family, she'd been hoping for him to come back. This was the Christmas miracle that she needed more than anything else. "And he's not alone, I see," Lupin said when the Minister of Magic, Scrimgeour, came into view. Everyone was completely stunned. Mrs. Weasley jumped out of her chair and went to the door, opening it. "Merry Christmas, Mother," Percy said. His voice was cold and formal. Nobody would have known that I was addressing his mother, who adored him, or being reunited with his family, most of which he hadn't seen in well over a year. "Oh Percy," she cried and threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly while Percy remained unmoved. The minister gave a quick explanation as to what brought this very sudden unannounced visit. That they were in the area on business, and being so close to the borough, Percy craved a visit home for the holiday. To everyone there it was quite clear that this was very far from the truth. To be honest, the only person who looked truly happy to see him was Mrs. Weasley. Arthur and the rest of the Weasley children all had mutinous looks on their faces. "Harry, why don't you join me for a walk in the garden while Percy catches up with his family?" Scrimgeour suggested. Harry stood up and Hermione started to follow. "No dear, you should stay here where it's warm," he said to her. Clearly he wanted to see Harry alone. "Harry." Hermione raised an eyebrow at him. "It's fine, Hermione," he assured her before grabbing his coat and following the minister out. Mrs. Weasley ushered Percy to the chair Harry had vacated between Hermione and Ron, both of which scooted their chairs as far from him as they could. There was a rigid silence at the dinner table that hadn't been there before Percy joined them. "So tell us, Percy dear, how are you?" Mrs. Weasley asked. "Yes, Weatherby, tell us how you are," Fred said with a cocky smirk. "Have they actually learned your name yet? Or have you had it legally changed so you could sever all ties with your blood traitor family?" "I'm quite well," he said, formally ignoring his brother's snips. "We've been very busy of late with the administration changing hands, this nasty business of you-know-who's return, and Amelia Bones' murder." Everyone was quite shocked at the ministry. "And just think, if you ministry lot would have listened to Harry and Dumbledore after the Triwizard Tournament and not had your heads up your a-dash." "George!" Mrs. Weasley scolded her son. Percy's ears turned pink. There was no proof other than a boy in shock's ravings. "Not just any boy. Do you honestly think Harry, of all people, would have lied about something like that? Especially considering you know who killed his family?" Hermione snapped. "I agree with George on this one. You ministry lot do have your heads up your asses." "Hear, hear." Fred raised his glass to Hermione, who was blushing with both embarrassment for losing her temper and anger. "It's easy for you have your self-riotous opinions when you have no idea how the world works." Percy said, his ears turning pink. "And neither do you. You have them spoon-fed to you from someone else instead of finding out for yourself what's the truth and what isn't," Arthur Weasley said quietly. "Funny, father, isn't that exactly what Dumbledore does to you lot? Getting orders from Dumbledore, who's spoon-fed them from Harry Potter, whose sanity is questionable at best. The fact that he hasn't been charged for the assault on the undersecretary to the minister is beyond me. Dolores Umbridge is a very sweet woman dash." Nobody was exactly sure what happened next. Ginny, Ron, and Hermione all jumped to their feet along with George, Fred, Arthur, Bill, and Lupin all drew their wands as Percy drew his. Somehow in all the commotion the bowl of mashed parsnips was launched in the air and managed to splatter in Percy's face. The only people still seated, was a wide-eyed Fleur and Molly. This was the scene that Harry had walked in on, and to be honest, if it wasn't for the murderous looks on everyone's faces and the tears in Mrs. Weasley's, the whole thing would have been quite comical. Harry was nervous, very nervous in fact. Sure, he'd met Hermione's parents before, during the summer before their second year of Hogwarts in Diagon Alley. Sure, he'd met Hermione's parents before, during the summer before their second year of Hogwarts in Diagon Alley. A lot had changed in that time. For one, Harry had met them as her friend then, now he was meeting them as her boyfriend. What if they didn't approve? He knew that she'd told them about their adventures at Hogwarts. What if they thought him as a troublemaker? Besides, it wasn't fair to Hermione not to see her family while they were on holiday. She never came out and said it, but Harry knew that she'd changed her plans at the last minute to go to the Burrow for Christmas instead of home, because she knew that it would be a difficult time for him. There were times that he wondered what he did to deserve someone like her. On New Year's Eve morning Lupin and Tonks arrived at the Burrow to act as escort to Hermione and Harry. While they were going to be out in the Muggle world and would probably be safe or as safe as one could be, Dumbledore was insistent that Harry wasn't to venture into public without members of the Order acting as guard and that he took his invisibility cloak just to be safe. They decided to travel by Muggle means as well as an effort not to draw attention. The car ride to Hermione's home was not uncomfortable, but there was defiantly something that wasn't quite right between Lupin and Tonks. It wasn't a secret that Tonks had been in a rut of sorts ever since Bellatrix Lestrange had murdered Sirius. Even her appearance was suffering from this. She was no longer able to morph her appearance at will, and the result of this was the mousy brown hair that replaced the bubblegum pink pixie cut that she usually sported. Not to mention that her patroness had changed form, into what they weren't sure or what had caused it. Lupin was rather run down as well. He'd confided in Harry that he'd been living among his own kind at Dumbledore's orders. Werewolves weren't exactly accepted among respectable wizards. Because of that, they tended to side among dark wizards who allowed them to gorge on flesh of hapless muggles and wizards alike. It was Lupin's job not only to act as spy for the Order but to try to convert as many of them to their side as well. Hermione couldn't help but smile when she saw how nervous Harry was. He could face down the most evil wizard their world had ever known, but the thought of facing her father and mother shook him to his core. She slid her hand in his, squeezing it gently as she led him up the stone path leading to the cottage her family called home. "Mum, Dad," she called as they went inside and removed their winter gear, tucking it into the closet beside the front door. "Hermione." Mrs. Granger walked into the living room. "We weren't expecting you for another hour or so." She hugged her daughter, then turned to Harry and gave him a hug as well. "Harry, how are you doing?" "Quite well," Harry said, hugging her back. "Hermione has told us so much about you, I feel I already know you. We were sorry when she told us you lost your godfather," she said, her concern showing in her eyes. "I'm doing much better," Harry assured her. "Come on in, I was just setting the table for tea. Mr. Granger will be down shortly, he's handling some business," she said, then noticed Lupin and Tonks who just came in. "Will you be joining us?" she asked. "No, we're here as escort for Harry and Hermione," Lupin said. "Yes," Hermione explained that there were dangerous wizards at large. She said, then changed the subject. "After your long drive you both have to be hungry as well." Mr. Granger ushered Hermione, Harry, Lupin, and Tonks into a small dining room where a small round table was. It was set with small sandwiches and biscuits. Shortly after they were seated at the tea table, Mr. Granger joined them. Mrs. Granger poured tea for all of them before sitting down with them. All the while she asked questions that any other normal would. How things at school were, if they were getting good marks. For the first time that he could remember, he was just a normal boy who was meeting his normal girlfriend's parents. There weren't millions of questions about his triumphs against Voldemort or what may or may not have happened the night Voldemort killed his family. Throughout tea they made small talk, and Mrs. Granger was interested in not only learning about their daughter's boyfriend but in Lupin and Tonks as well. After they were finished, Tonks, Hermione, and Mrs. Granger set to the task of clearing the table. Mr. Granger invited Harry and Lupin to join him in the sitting room. Harry followed him, but Lupin excused himself. Once again Harry found himself nervous. He'd heard all kinds of tales from Fred and George about the horror of meeting girlfriends' fathers. While he knew that for the most part they were all greatly exaggerated, but still they had to have some root somewhere, didn't they? "Hermione has told us much about you, Harry," Mr. Granger said after a few moments of silence. "All good, I hope, sir," Harry said with a nervous laugh. "Did she tell you that until she went to Hogwarts she didn't have any friends?" Mr. Granger asked. Harry shook his head. He and Ron had assumed, but they never brought the subject up. After all, Harry hadn't been exactly swimming in friends before he went either. No, sir, she didn't. Hermione was different from the day she was born. We always knew that she'd be something special, but we didn't know what. From the time she was able to read, she'd hid herself away in the library poring over book after book. She never came out and said it, but she wasn't happy, not really. I didn't know that, Harry said. Then she went to Hogwarts and she met you and Ron. The summer after her first year she came home and she was beaming. We honestly didn't know what to think, he said with a laugh. Did she ever tell you how we became friends, sir? Harry asked. Honestly, we didn't ask questions, we were just happy she had someone. Harry went on to tell him about the duel at midnight and the troll in the girls' toilet. By the time he was done, both he and Mr. Granger was laughing so hard that they had tears in their eyes. To be honest, sir, if it wasn't for Hermione, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. She saved my life in many ways. When it was time for her to go back to Hogwarts this year, to be honest, we weren't sure if it was safe. Harry nodded. I understand. Do you love Hermione? Mr. Granger asked. Harry nodded. More than anything. She's my only daughter, she's my pride, and the best thing I've ever done in my life, Mr. Granger said. They sat in silence for several minutes. I'm trusting you, Harry Potter, to take care of her. I know that something big is happening, I can see it every time I read the paper or watch the news. The bridge collapsing wasn't of natural causes, no matter what Hermione tried to assure me of. She thinks she's protecting us because against the people in your world we're like sitting ducks. It's my job to take care of her and I can't. Harry nodded. The way Mr. Granger looked at him, the intensity of his words seared into him. I'll do my best, you have my word, he said. Please like and subscribe.